If there is if there is one thing that kills long series, it's power creep. And this is sort of frustrating because long series are great. Readers like them, authors like them. They're good for everybody. But if you don't nail the power creep issue properly, it can really ruin a good thing. For anybody who's new to this channel, my name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I've written like 25 books, published most of them, and I make these videos because there are a lot of authors out there who aren't making it, and I don't want you to be one of them. Today we're going to be talking about power creep. Even the best authors can fall into this trap of power creep. It's honestly something that's really hard to deal with. And if we want to deal with it, then we need to understand what it is and why it is so damaging to a story. If you don't know what power creep is, it's a term that has come around because of the proliferation of games. Power creep in a game specifically is when new content or new features show up and invalidate old features, making them sort of pointless. And power creep happens in stories too. You see this a lot with progression fantasy. And since progression fantasy is slowly infiltrating everything else, you're starting to see it in more fantasy and sci-fi just in general. But power creep is sort of that experience in a story when the hero levels up and has to face a bigger, badder threat in the villain, but then also gains bigger and badder powers themselves. And all of a sudden, things that would have been a challenge for them earlier are just sort of not a challenge anymore or totally irrelevant. In any story that they're telling, an author has to balance the resources and abilities of a hero with the level of challenge that is being thrown their way. Imagine that we wrote a story about Luke Skywalker, and he's some small kid on a farm who desperately doesn't want to be there. And then the Empire sweeps in with all of its military might. If we never gave Luke any new powers, if he just remained that simple, ignorant farm boy, there's absolutely no way that he would ever be able to take on the Empire. And even if we did contrive for him to take on the Empire in that state, nobody would believe it. You'd hear cries of plot armor everywhere. And it would just feel, well, it would feel contrived. And so, as the story progresses, what do? Well, he gets powers, he gets abilities, he gets allies, he gets things that allow him to grow and mature as an individual and to level up or progress in his ability to impact the world. On the other hand, we need to do the same thing with the enemies. If Uncle Ben picked him up from the farm and they're heading off to find Han Solo, and the first people they run across are not two nameless, faceless stormtroopers, but instead Darth Vader, then that's going to be a very, very, very short story. But instead, we see him facing off against progressive threats. And then at the culmination of his story, he faces the biggest, baddest person around, the Emperor, right? And so we have this progression as he sort of levels up through the enemies that he has to face, the challenges that he has to face. If you threw the hardest challenge at him first, he's just not equipped to deal with it. And so it would make for an unsatisfying story. And the same thing would be true if Bilbo steps out of his door, Smaug shows up, and burns the entire Shire to the ground. That level of challenge wouldn't be appropriate. Bilbo has to grow as a character, gaining strength through his own abilities, his allies, the encounters that he's had, before he can face off against the dragon. But the problem is that sometimes in our rush to level our character up, we give them abilities and powers that just make the previous challenges they've faced feel hollow, sort of obsolete. And that can create a disconnect for our reader. And the reason it creates a disconnect is because real life isn't like that. Real life is not a linear progression. When we read a story, it is a linear progression. It has to be a linear progression because a story is about movement. It's about going from one place to another place. But that's not what real life is like. Real life is not a series of challenges that I gain abilities and skills to overcome that happen one after another in a predictable sort of cadence. Instead, life is messy. Life just happens. But if we were to represent that in our stories, readers would find it overwhelming, and they would probably find it too close to home to be able to then disconnect from the real world and enjoy the escape of whatever story we're telling. And so we have this balance that we have to strike between understanding that the progression of our character has to happen, it has to be there, but also that if we're not careful, we end up mismatching the abilities and skills of our protagonist with the level of challenge that is coming their way. And finding the sweet spot is magic. That's what makes stories, series in particular, so engaging. Now, there is also some wiggle room here, because some stories, the protagonist seems to suffer their way through, and some stories, the protagonist triumphs their way through. And these are two different styles of storytelling that feed different audiences, and they're both great. We just have to understand that in both cases, we have to balance the level of ability with the level of challenge. And no matter which way you go, you're going to find readers who don't like that particular style of book, and that's totally okay. But what we need to focus on is ensuring that we're aware of what kind of progression we're giving our characters. We are aware of what kind of power creep is happening, because power creep has to happen. You have to level up. If your character remains the same all the way through, people are going to get bored and they're going to put your books down. So we have to level up, but we also have to be cautious and make sure we're matching our level of ability with our level of challenge. If you're interested in hearing more of this particular type of content, like specific author content, how to write, a peek behind the curtain at what it's like to be a writer, then I've just started a newsletter. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Seth, why would I want to get an email from you? And the reason you want to get an email from me is because, and this is super secret, so don't tell anybody, I'm going to be putting all of my secrets in this newsletter. So if you want to really understand how this works, how to do this, then I'm inviting you specifically, that's right, you, to sign up for this secret newsletter. Again, don't tell anybody about this. It's super secret. You can sign up in the link in the description, but don't worry, I'm not going to tell anybody else what this link is for. It's just for you. The other nice thing is that an email list gives me a better way to interact with you. And so if you have questions or thoughts or comments or concerns, things you want to talk about, then the newsletter is going to give you a way to do that. It's a lot easier than typing in comments here. I mean, don't stop leaving comments, obviously. But if there's something specific you want to talk about with me, then after you sign up for the newsletter, just reply to one of the emails that you get. After you've signed up for that super secret newsletter, do me a favor and leave me a comment letting me know what series you've read that does progression the best and what series just suffers from rampant power creep and is totally unbalanced. Hopefully it's not one of mine.